I think it's time to start. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name's Robin Mansell. I'm a professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics. And I have with me three brilliant other very active participants in TPRC, who will introduce themselves in a second. TPRC stands for the Research Conference on Communications, Information, and Internet Policy. It's into its 48th year, and it has always done its utmost to involve PhD students and early career postdoc people in its proceedings. And so when we were thinking about webinars for this series, we thought, how many times are we as teachers or researchers with junior colleagues asked, what can I expect of you if you're a student? What can you do to help me navigate my way through what are incredibly disruptive and disturbing times in the face of the pandemic? And I think this is true wherever you are in the world and whatever university you're at. So the purpose of today's webinar is preparing for a research future during COVID. And we hope to hear questions from you. You can put them in the Q&A, and we will come to them definitely in the last 15 minutes of today. But before that, we hope to have a free-flowing conversation. We have some questions that were posed to us by students already, and we'll try to address them. So without more from me, I will turn to Marjorie Blumenthal to introduce herself.
Great, thank you, Robin. So I am the person who fled graduate school because she wanted to work directly on policy issues. I'm currently a senior policy researcher at RAND, but over the last 30 years, I have watched the Washington, D.C. area ecosystem of think tanks and other research organizations evolve, and that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you. And Derrick?
Thank you very much, Robin. My name is Derrick Cogburn. I am happy to be here, and thanks to you and TPRC for organizing this event. I am a professor at American University. I have a joint appointment between the School of International Service, where I'm in the International Communication and International Development programs. And I'm also jointly appointed in the Kogod School of Business in our Department of Information Technology and Analytics. And I also am the founding executive director of our Institute on Disability and Public Policy. And I am the faculty co-director of our Internet Governance Lab. So I wear many hats in the academic environment.
And next, Martin.
Hi, I'm Martin Weiss. I'm a professor at the University of Pittsburgh in the School of Computing and Information. I've been a longtime participant in TPRC, and again, I also want to extend my thanks to TPRC for this panel and making this opportunity available. So in addition to being professor, I'm associate director of our new Center for Governance and Markets, where we do research on governance systems for technology and public policy and public affairs.
Good, thank you. I guess I should have said that my own research interest itself is quite interdisciplinary, but at the moment, my big thing is, guess what? Platforms, competition policy, which is the flavor of the month, it seems. So we thought we'd kick off by me posing a question. And one of the things that has been asked and asked, unsurprisingly, is if vacancies for jobs when you're just finishing your PhD or just finishing a term-limited postdoc are really disappearing. Is this temporary? We don't have crystal balls, but is it temporary? And is it just a pipe dream to even expect to get a job in the field in which you have trained so hard in the last years? And what are the kinds of variations that we are seeing across disciplines? Are there some areas where the prospects are a little better, and does it vary by universities? So I throw that question out onto the table, and I'll call on Marjorie to go first, but then
Sure.
either of you chime in afterwards.
So to begin with, we do know that PhDs have been overproduced for a long time. To me, it's always been a little bit cynical to have universities refer to the future professoriate in describing their doctoral students, although those people do serve the university by being teaching assistants and so on. So if you take that perspective, then there is a big world outside of the ivory tower, which offers a lot of opportunities. There's something interesting in the way the question was posed, which relates to the fit between the jobs that are out there and what you train to do. One of the things that intrigues me at RAND is that I am surrounded by a number of fresh PhDs who are drifting away from the fields they were trained in, especially if they were trained in STEM. Social science, you can continue to apply that, but maybe not 100% of the time. But I think that the reality is a mixed bag, and part of success is in broadening one's outlook and being willing and able, we'll talk a little bit about able later, but being willing to be open to something that isn't strictly speaking related to what you have just been training in and working on.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Especially as disciplines have become, in some ways, narrower and narrower, students are confronting that problem. Who'd like to go next? Martin.
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, I would say, first of all, that, you know, the availability of jobs depends very much on the field. I mean, so we are going to be hiring this year. I mean, so if you're in the computing area, if you have any relationship with data science and analytics, those are areas of great interest still, and there are still not that there are zero opportunities. I guess I would like to put that out there. The other thing is, and I agree with Marjorie, you kind of have to take a broad view of who you are as a researcher. I mean, if you imagine that you're going to continue doing the thing that you were writing your dissertation on, you know, I would say the probabilities are rather small. But if you conceptualize yourself as somebody with a set of skills who's interested in a kind of a class of problems, you'll fare much better, and you may end up in industry, you may end up in academia, you may end up in think tanks. I mean, there really are lots of different opportunities if you can conceptualize yourself broadly.
Right.
Sure.
I would add to that. I think, Marjorie, you really hit the nail on the head when you talked about the overproduction of PhDs. So academic careers and academic employment has long been difficult with the supply exceeding the demand in many ways, and as a result, creating some really interesting dynamics within the faculty with different types of positions and alternative workforces and so forth. So it is challenging, and certainly has been exacerbated by this period. And I'll come back to what Martin was describing as well around data science and analytics in just a moment. But I'm optimistic. I do think that it will come back. Employment will come back. But I think what we come back to is going to be quite different. So one of the things that we have, I think, understood is that what we used to think of as normal academic work is, and the university itself is going to be dramatically changed by what we've had to do the last half a year and then more as we go forward. Some people talk about this as coming back to the new normal, but we won't come back to, I would argue, and this is exciting for me because I've been studying distributed collaboration for a long time, but I don't think we'll come back to a university where you'll be teaching in an environment where everybody is there face to face. You're going to be working in a distributed environment. Students are going to demand it. Faculty are going to have those kinds of skills. And so it will be less important perhaps where you're located. So thinking about employment and hiring, not the way it used to be with pressure to be in the hot, centers of DC or New York or LA or, London or wherever the places may be, but offering a lot more flexibility in terms of where you can be located to participate in academic employment. And in terms of areas and fields, as Martin said, we've seen in the data analytics side, lots of opportunities for hiring, continuing to hire, lots of opportunities for our students in those spaces as well. So I am overall optimistic, Robin.
I was born an optimist, and it's harder and harder in these COVID times. But it makes me think that it's worth saying that a plug for the softer social sciences, if you like. Certainly in some universities in Europe that teach in the English languages, there are all sorts of adverts for jobs. So if you happen to be mobile, of course, young families may not be mobile, but if you happen to be mobile, the possibilities are out there for being attracted to a place that is pretty much not somewhere you might have thought about in the first instance. So it's always good to keep an eye open on job sites for the kinds of positions that are opening up. I think another thing to bear in mind, not just the going online, but some of the overproduction of PhDs has led to fixed term contracts. So being aware that old tenure or permanent contract systems in many universities, perhaps not the top league, but many of them are rapidly becoming scarce. And that creates issues, I think. But it makes me think, a related question, when you're presenting yourself and thinking about where am I going to go, where am I going to land, is how am I going to be measured, or what are prospective employers actually looking for? Could you respond to those kinds of issues?
So Robin, I actually wanted to pick up on a couple of things that you said, and also something that Derrick said in I think there will be growing demand for people with good teaching skills. And some of the trends towards online have fed this. Your comment, Robin, about demand for people with English language who might be asked to teach elsewhere in the world. Clearly, people in PhD programs are focused on doing research, but paying special attention to the skills of teaching, at least in the short term, can be an advantage. And then to connect that back to the last part of your question, Robin, communication skills. How good are you on your feet? How well do you interact? How do you engage with people remotely? Can you do small talk, as well as are you able to chunk out your teaching in a different way than the old stand and deliver lectures? I think a lot of people are getting that experience with today's demand for online teaching. But especially if you leave the university and then go out into a think tank or government or business world, you have to be able to talk in a non-technical manner and convey your ideas. You have to be relatively succinct. You have to be able to listen. It's not just about you, but oral communication is a huge issue. And so is written communication, even if the packaging of the writing is not going to be in a chapter length package or a book length package. But especially in a lot of think tank contexts, there are much smaller packages. And being able to think about the structure, the form, the use of visual aids, communications is a really big issue now, and a very important skill set for everybody.
Yeah.
I think another set of skills to build on that are the skills around collaboration. So much of academia has been built on solo research and solo performance, solo evaluation, which is obviously important. But one of the things that I think will continue to define the next period is how well one can collaborate with others across distances and to collaborate outside the academy. There are some tremendous opportunities for research that get facilitated by partnerships and arrangements between academics and industry, academics and government, academics and civil society organizations and institutions. And I think the better that a new researcher can balance both the need to demonstrate their individual capabilities, but also to be really good at collaboration is going to help them. And that also will help with one of the other metrics, which is funding. So being able to get externally funded research is harder and harder individually because of the complex interdisciplinary nature of problems, and being able to work in teams across disciplines to secure research funding is a great skill.
Yeah. Martin, anything to add?
Yeah, well, you know, one is I did want to get back to your question about measures and metrics, how you're going to be measured, and to some extent that depends on what kind of a professor you are. You had mentioned, Robin, earlier that we have this gold standard of a permanent contract in a tenure stream in the U.S. anyway context, and as everywhere, we're seeing a transition from, or I would call it perhaps a rebalancing. I guess you can tell that I was an administrator for a number of years. So, I mean, we have an increasing number of appointment stream contracts, which are fixed term. But I mean, we actually find when we talk to our people, to people who are both in the tenure and the non-tenure stream, that at least in some instances, especially people returning from industry, the appointment stream offers some advantages. I mean, first of all, appointment stream people who are in industry are kind of used to the idea of not having a permanent contract, right? I mean, you're always subject to changes in the marketplace, and so it's not that exceptional to everybody except us who are tenured professors, I guess, right? But kind of funding pressures, you can actually write the measures into the contract that you write. You know, so if you can say that you wish to be measured by, student evaluations or the number of student hours that you teach or some combination of that. We are, at least in our school, we're taking a very flexible view of what an appointment stream professor is. Many of these people are people who have experience in industry, and they, for various reasons, come to academia, and it's not that they're not research active, but the kind of research they do is really very different, and it's very applied. And it's the kind of thing that doesn't get necessarily the kind of NSF funding that, those of us in the tenure stream have to be able to demonstrate on a yearly basis in order to go on. So I think, the appointment stream does have some advantages, especially for people who are returning. I mean, that's kind of a roundabout way of answering or addressing your question. I don't know if I answered a thing, but
And if I could just add to that, Martin, one of the things that I think in that type of appointment is the multi-year contracts that I think really have an impact. When it's year by year, that really is somewhat disruptive. It's disruptive to students, it's disruptive to administrators trying to plan and so forth. But if you can have a multi-year, even a 5-year, term contract, that can be extremely productive as a role to play.
And when we talk about our appointment stream professors, that's the model I have in mind. I mean, we do have adjuncts that we bring in who are teaching, this course or that course, and that's a different sort of a thing. They don't really fall under the same evaluation. And at least in our school, these are not people who are expecting to making a living off of the wages. I mean, this is extra salary for people who are otherwise employed.
So I wanted to follow up on
ahead,
Martin's comment about applied research, because if I then think about the think tank world, you can find a spectrum. You know, RAND calls itself a nonprofit research organization, and it has people who get NSF and NIH funding. But we also get support of different kinds and do work that would be considered applied. If you look at other think tanks, some of them put out analyses. We could have an interesting argument on a separate day about whether what is behind the analyses is actually research. But the main point is there is a huge spectrum from more to less applied. And if you are the kind of person who is interested in practical problems out in the world, then there are a number of outlets where you can pursue those problems. They just might not support you in a tenure line position. Although possibly, you know, somebody could speak to the soft money funded research institutes that a lot of universities have, and whether they hire a different kind of people than the tenure line departments.
Well, it seems to me for people who are considering what next, one thing is listening carefully to what you hear, not just being able to present, as we said earlier, but being able to listen, because in listening, you can pick up the nuances of what people are really looking for. And in addition, to look really carefully at what kind of institution you're applying to. So, and it varies by country, but it also varies by university and by think tank and by private sector or government department. And they all will be having somewhat different metrics, different ways of going about deciding what it is that they're looking for and what sort of performance indicators they're interested in. In the UK, I'm horrified to have to say that if it's academia, at the moment at least, it's still very much academic output, standard academic outputs. But I know that that is changing elsewhere, particularly in the United States, and I think in Canada as well. So being able to present your work in different ways is a hugely crucial skill. When I was a younger person, I was always told I needed to be multivocal or something like that. I needed to be able to talk to policymakers. I needed to be able to talk to theoreticians. I won't tell you which one I was better at, but you need to really bear that in mind. And I think that is pretty standard across the discipline. Just carefully, and then try to craft your own presentation of yourself into a fashion that will meet the expectations. I also wanted to put to you, because I think it's relevant given we're talking about fixed term and permanent type contracts. Are you seeing any changes in terms of the gender bias? There are at least some statistics in some countries that suggest that women tend to be pushed into the shorter term contracts more quickly than males. And also, given the changes, the Black Lives Matter, are there any signs that things are opening up a little bit more in terms of opportunities from a diversity point of view?
I mean, I can say, at least in a school that I've been associated with, finding women who can teach in the computing area has always been a challenge, and we've always prioritized that wherever we could. We haven't always been successful at hiring women, and we still are predominantly male, I have to say. And in terms of the ethnic balance, that always has been a struggle for us as well. We've, you know, for years we've prioritized it, and it's in fact we started a program together with it's funded by the Mellon Foundation to introduce rising juniors into the research in computing and information area, with the hopes that in 5 years or so, we might start seeing some PhD students who would be ready to hire. So, I mean, it has been a priority for us, but if we look around our faculty, we don't see much result from that priority.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
From what I see, I mean, this is a moment in time when there's such a spotlight on diversity, equity, and inclusion that it, at least where I am, which is outside of a university, it pervades every opportunity, whether it's a recruitment for a job, internal competitions for seed funding for research, external funding by foundations for research. It is a moment where it gives me hope that the situation will improve for a lot of people who might have been frustrated in the past. The situation might not directly or in the short term alleviate the situation that Martin described, but in so many others. Rand has always done work on well-being, but it has seized the moment to form a new center to coalesce some of the work it had done in discrete pockets into a new center for race and ethnicity. And it will put a spotlight on those issues. And it's recruiting a director. And it will be looking for funding and for personnel who will be, who will bring greater diversity to work on those topics than might otherwise have happened. And that's just one illustration. Right. So, right. I may be playing the optimist here, but it is a moment that gives me optimism.
Well, I'll split the difference. So first I wanted to just circle back to Martin's earlier point about the multi-year term contract. So there's a role for them to play and to give people the unique opportunities, Martin, you were talking about and so forth. But I think it's problematic when they are used to not create more tenure track or tenure line positions, which is what I think tends to happen sometimes. And then obviously there's a difference between the adjuncts who, are usually doing something else. And, this is nice to bring those skills in, but it's these term contracts, 1 year, 2 year, for us up to 5 year term contracts where I think the issue really lies. And going back to Robin's point, yes, from what we can see, a lot of the people that occupy those term positions are women, are people of color. And they then get counted in terms of what's visual. Oh, we have more women or we have more people of color. But if you drill down, they're not in the tenure track. And that's very problematic. So yes, there's this great use of those type of positions, but there's also kind of a cover that gets used with those kinds of positions. Now, we're lucky enough, and I would encourage the students that are thinking about this and thinking about those kinds of positions, we have kind of an organized body to support those positions. So there's I think it's a vice provost position for term faculty or something like that. So we're really trying to look at supporting the careers of those type of academics. And I think that's really important. The other issue, just if I can quickly, Robin, the other issue is it's frustrating for so many institutions to talk about how difficult it is to recruit people of color and women because they're out there. And Marjorie, I liked what you said about the actions of demonstrating, putting resources behind centers and recruiting and support for those types of hires, and not just and not saying Martin or anybody is saying this, but there's been too many instances where they say, oh, we're trying, but we can't find anybody, so we stick with what we've always had, and that's just not sufficient. It's also not sufficient to bring one person in and spend all this energy on recruiting a person and not have an environment that supports them once they're there. So cluster hires and strategies like that are also really important. And the last thing I just want to say, Marjorie, back to your point about the moment that we're in. If anybody watched the very unique NBA Finals this year, of having to take place in this bubble in Orlando, the visual representation of that corporation, the National Basketball Association, to support for Black Lives Matter, for voting rights and voter suppression, and a whole range of other issues as a corporate entity was astounding. And that's happening across multiple corporate entities, and I think it's pretty exciting.
Yes.
Good. Glad to hear that things are moving. I wish they would move faster, but we do what we can. It brings to mind that this webinar is also about what can you ask of your mentor or advisor. I can imagine that many people in around March got really stopped in terms of the research they were able to carry out. Because it just wasn't possible. They thought things were blocked because of the lockdown in various places. Access to research materials might have been blocked. Computer labs might have been shut, etc. Perhaps we should talk a little bit about what kinds of resources are really still available. And I know, Derrick, you have something to say about that, and others may as well, because we all do different types of research. So maybe we could turn to that question. If I'm a student, I come and I say, my research has come to a grinding halt, help. I need something to put on the table because I'm in my final year and I want to get a job and I must complete my research. What do I do? What kinds of chameleon-like strategies can you apply in order to turn something into a workable project?
Yes, I think that in some ways this is a pretty exciting period because it's forcing us to go back and rethink about some of those opportunities. So one is there are a number of large-scale repositories for data sets, pre-existing data sets that are just phenomenal and just haven't been sufficiently exploited because everybody wants to go out and do their own field research and their own news surveys and so forth. So if you look at one of the longstanding ones, the ICPSR at Michigan, the University of Connecticut, University of Virginia, Harvard, there are a number of places where you have these aggregate repositories, and the National Science Foundation for the last decade or so has required all projects that get funded by NSF to make their data, the National Science Foundation, to make their data publicly available. And so you need these kinds of repositories. And so they'll have terms of use, and sometimes there'll be an embargo or whatever the case may be. They all have data dictionaries usually. So these are great repositories of data that could be better exploited, and they just haven't been because, everybody's going to do their own. Another advantage that we have is the open government, open data revolution. So many governments are now trying to make at national and regional and state and local levels, making analyze those large-scale data sets is really, I think, an important opportunity. And lastly, for me, I do a lot of work in text analytics. And so text mining, unstructured text, whether it be transcripts, email archives, published articles, you name it, social media, this becomes a very dynamic, interesting, albeit problematic in some way, data source for us to consider, but you have to have the skills to be able to exploit all of these different types of data.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Martin?
If I could just follow up on Derrick's point about having the skills, because there was earlier discussion of data science and data scientists. You don't need to be majoring in those fields to be an effective data scientist. I mean, what I see around me every day and for my entire time at RAND is that people come in with all kinds of backgrounds, from astrophysics to anthropology, and they know how to use data science skills. Some of them do text mining. I'm thinking about a particular anthropologist. But more than that, if they didn't know coming in, there are so many courses online that a lot of people are autodidacts. They take a course online, they refine their skills, they build on what little, computer science or statistics or something else quantitative that they started out with. And regardless of their field, they become a data scientist. And many of them are actually just repackaging themselves as data scientists, which you can do for the short term or for the longer term. But this is a moment where that kind of adaptability and an ability to talk about your skills, especially if you've built up your skills, would be very valuable.
Yeah.
Well, I agree, so, I mean, we actually, one of our higher demand services, we do have some service courses to the community to the Pitt community on data science in case people, from English or wherever want to learn some of these skills. So, I mean, this is something that we as a school are offering, so, I mean, look around your university and see what's there. I also wanted to kind of double down on what Derrick said about flexibility, in terms of how you're going to conduct your research. It's, and I think back on my career and what I've seen, and this has actually always been a useful skill. With research, you might have a plan going in, you don't know how it's going to turn out. And, you may end up at a dead end and you have to be able to adapt to it. I mean, that's just how it is in research. COVID has presented us with unique with a particular kind of a limitation, but it may be unique, but it's not the only time you're going to see that in your career. I mean, you may not see this one again the way it is today, but there'll be something else. And so the ability to adapt and to pivot is going to serve well into the career, whether it's pivoting a little bit to data science, as Marjorie was talking about, or pivoting to, pick up, other new skills or looking at other kinds of data sets. I think this is something that we all have to do. I mean, I know for myself, I've had to pivot a couple of times in my career because, funding ran out or, it was no longer, highly publishable or whatever. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why you have to pivot.
Robin, if I could just add one point there. I think it's been really exciting for me having a joint appointment, having a foot in two different schools and seeing exactly what Marjorie and Martin are talking about. So on the one hand, I teach data scientists. I teach in our MS Analytics program, incredibly skilled and talented students who are doing all kinds of predictive modeling and really working hard on that side. But on the other side, I teach a joint course on big data analytics and text mining between the two schools. And so and it has two different sections, so I can see how both sections perform. The students that are registering in the analytics program and the students who are registering in international relations and other programs. So I can see how they perform differently. But I make it a point of exactly what Marjorie said is to help these students who are not going to be trained as data scientists to not fear these techniques. You can program too, and I can show you how to do this. And now that group of students is now exposed to these
that persistence is a good thing in these times because in March and even as recently as a month or so ago, we've had PhD students who were doing interview-based studies where they really needed to talk to industry people or they really needed to talk to policymakers. And of course, they were just drowning in either concern about their own area or they're just too busy. And so they were getting no responses. And the temptation is to panic. But what I've seen is that persistence pays off and that as time goes on, while we don't return to anything like normal, people do begin to realize that yes, if you're asking a question that they find is relevant to their industry or to their policymaking process, they have begun to reopen doors. So although you might be delayed in your work, it's not absolutely for certain that you're going to have to stop using one method and absolutely switch to another one. And I fully support what's been said about data science with the addition that there's lots of room and scope for ensuring that the data science techniques get contextualized. and people that know how to contextualize those tools and not just treat them as off the shelf, but actually make them work so that we really understand where does the data come from, how do we best interpret these modeled outcomes, what kinds of predictive techniques are useful in what settings and which ones maybe are not so useful and could even be biased and harmful. So I think all of those kinds of skills coming from different disciplines are very much, in demand these days.
Robin, that point connects back to something that Derrick said earlier. Actually, two things he said. Number one, he talked about the range of data sets, and COVID-19 has led, if you're interested in anything related to it, to a surge in production and sharing of specialized data sets. But it also has led to a surge in new kinds of collaborations, often international, to work on something related to COVID-19. And those collaborations in turn are often multidisciplinary. So for people who have the flexibility, the interest, the persistence, this is a great time to dive in on those topics, even if you're a kibitzer on the side, because you'll make connections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that I certainly, and I'm sure you also get asked now that we've gone online so much, is how on earth do you work out a decent work-life balance? I mean, it's always been a challenge for somebody getting into a field which they can feel pretty competitive at times. And it sometimes feels as if you have to just work harder and harder. And harder is not always the answer. In fact, it rarely is the answer. So could you respond a little bit about what advice you feel that you give people nowadays in terms of, I guess you could call it almost pastoral advice about how on earth do I manage my life when I'm being asked to be online all the time?
Sure. So, it's, I guess for myself, and I'm, well past the time when I have young kids at home, so you have to qualify that. I mean, for people who have young children at home, the advice is, it's a much more challenging problem. I have colleagues with young children, and they're struggling deeply with this question, far more than I am. But, so when my children were young, I made it a policy to basically not respond to work when I was at home. I mean, this allowed me to be present for my family, and when I was at work, I could be fully present at work, and that worked out very well for me. I make it clear, especially for my students, when they can expect a response from me in terms of what hours and what days, and I try my best to stick to it. Now, I do make exceptions, but I think setting up boundaries like that are important, and communicating what those boundaries are to your colleagues goes a long way. Now, does it solve all of the problems? No. I mean, one of the benefits, I would say, of this time is that we have access to webinars like this, and they can occur at any time of day, any day of the week, depending on where you are. I find my because of that as well. So, I guess that's what I would say. I mean, and for families with young children, I don't know quite what to say, because I'm just not in that position. And I guess I know that our institution tries to make accommodation for faculty members who have children at home in terms of tenure, in terms of teaching responsibilities and so forth. But I think that's going to be a challenge, and unfortunately, it tends to fall more on women than it does on men, and so it's one of the sources of unfairness that we see in the institution.
Mm. Yeah. Other observations?
I certainly agree with Martin on the people with young children exception. if you set them aside, which may be hard, I agree on the setting boundaries, which will really depend on whether the people you're trying to fend off allow you to do that. There's only so much that you can do unilaterally. And so if that doesn't work, it may be cold comfort, but the beginning of a career tends to be the period where you work the hardest and the craziest hours. And I may be showing that I am not a junior person anymore when I say that, but it is what I observe in people of all cohorts that I work with. The last thing I would say is that if you are outside of academia, and maybe to some extent inside academia, time management skills really matter. I work in a timesheet environment. And unlike the people who are the primary audience for this seminar, I know that junior people are a lot cheaper than I am. So I have to be really careful about the hours that I charge to a project. But having a way of metering yourself, of knowing whether you are dithering, whether you are being inefficient, or figuring out what lets you be efficient, young children being present aside, can be a huge asset and very much of a life skill.
Yeah.
I think this is such an important question, and we are experiencing something that is so unprecedented. And I appreciate in both instances the idea of setting the people with children aside, but those of us who have children, it is extremely challenging. And my son is upstairs. Our university is 100% virtual right now. His school is 100% virtual. He's upstairs online. My wife is downstairs teaching online. I'm here online. It's brutal. It is brutal. And so you have to have mechanisms to balance. Now, with that said, both Robert and Martin, this is something, and Marjorie, this is something I think you were alluding to. So those of us who are tenure track, full professors, you come through that process makes you run so fast all the time. You're geared towards that lifestyle and that level of productivity and output. It's hard to stop. It's like a huge ship that is, it's almost impossible to stop. So it just keeps going and going and going. And, that's what we were created as, and that's what we do. But you have to be deliberate about creating that space and that time. And so, Marjorie, one of the things that I recommend to doctoral students all the time, and even to faculty, is it's called the Getting Things Done methodology, the GTD methodology. It's a time management strategy. And one of the things that it teaches you is how to renegotiate intangible tasks. When you're making something physical, it's only so many of these physical things that can be made. But these intangible things, like Martin was saying, am I on this webinar or that webinar? Can I do this intangible thing and that intangible thing? And so you have to now renegotiate. So you don't just not do it. You say, hey, Robin, my time is I cannot get this done at the time that I said it. If you can give me another week, now I'll be able to do that. But I'm managing, all of these processes. And then just on a personal side, go outside, Robin, walk, get fresh air. I love the water. I'm a boater. And so I like to sail as much as I can and get on the water, take walks by the water and practice yoga. These are things that I put in place to make sure I stay balanced.
Exercise. And I like your use of the word renegotiate, because I think we all have to relearn from time to time in our driven world. There's a tendency to feel as if you just can't leave it. And I admit to having to relearn that every once in a while myself. But once it gets into your head, you realize that you wake up the next morning and the world's still there. And apart from formal commitments, there's an awful lot of space in there that you can manage. We actually have 2 questions from the audience now. Martin, I think it says here that you're going to respond to this one. It's a question about students coming from developing countries who may not be able to afford tuition fees and living expenses in the US or the UK. What kinds of arrangements are being put in place?
Well, so I mean, I guess what I wanted to say about that is it depends a lot on the funder. I mean, so usually for the most part, we don't hire students who are not physically on campus for teaching assistant types of positions. So it may be that some funders permit remote attendance, but our hands are often tied as far as that goes. I appreciate the question that Mohammed asked. I mean, and it is a hard one to address because the tuition fees are high here in comparison to other parts of the world. And I agree that we're missing quite a bit of talent that we could be getting simply on an economic basis. I mean, that's the best. I know it's not exactly an answer, but
so I would say that the period that we're going through, I think, has finally changed these dynamics. I've been teaching online since 1996, and I have been a proselytizer of people teaching online since then. And I've met so much resistance over the years with people telling me it can't be done and you can't teach this that way and so forth. Now that everybody has moved into that space and has had to learn it and has been trained, we've gotten an enormous amount of training, to cope with this pandemic. Even me, who's been teaching for so long. As I was saying earlier, I don't think we're going back to that place where everybody has to be face-to-face and people think that that's the way it has to be done. So there's going to be a tremendous advantage for people like Mohammed, where we say, okay, Mohammed, we charge full freight for our master's program or for our PhD program or whatever the case may be. I'll leave the PhD program out for a moment, but we charge full freight for our education. If you can pay for the fees, but you don't have to pay the living expenses of living in Washington, D.C. You can stay at home and still take this course. You don't have to have the travel. And so I think it's going to open up tremendous opportunities. And I don't think we're going to go back to the way it was before.
Okay, we'll have to see what the crystal ball tells us in several years.
Well, I mean, I actually don't, I personally am not opposed to the idea of having students residing in other countries doing work that teaching assistants do. I think it's possible. I mean, and I think COVID has shown us that it's possible. I think the issue really are institutional and to some extent political. I mean, in the US, okay, so it is election season, so I can just see political ads now saying that, oh, they shipped all these teaching assistant jobs overseas, and it's not exactly what we're doing because it's part of a graduate training, graduate education process. But we would have to keep it that way. We would have to have a great deal of integrity about that.
Yeah. Marjorie, anything on that?
So not so much on the full-time student, but I would note from my one interlude as a university administrator that Georgetown had a binational class and actually had two of them. And to me, the idea of blending people who live in different environments is incredibly powerful. I'm not aware of a program that does that explicitly for the purpose of international mixing, but as we all get the kinds of experiences that Derrick referred to, there's no reason why we couldn't evolve to a model like that. But in the meantime, yes, you're going to find universities charging full freight for these programs, in part because doing them well is not cheap and might even be more expensive than the old face-to-face kind of teaching.
Who wish to acquire an education, and also remembering that some aspects of person-to-person communication still do matter, and that they're also culturally specific. And universities and other institutions are always finding it hard to change. And I think for the early career people coming along, perhaps better than anyone how your needs need to be met. And so making your voices heard and making sure your administrations hear what needs to be done, I think is really, really important. And it speaks to another question that we have. This is from Greg Taylor. Are we compromising the quality of the educational experience to accommodate, in quotes, flexibility? If the answer is yes, should we? Anybody want to respond to him?
So I think the answer is no, we're not compromising quality. And I'll just give two quick examples. So in the spring, about February, I guess, before spring break, we had our traditional semester was moving along. And after, when many students and faculty left during spring break, and we never came back. So we had to pivot very quickly to thinking about teaching online and teaching from home and letting students, take classes from wherever they are. And that was the rest of the spring semester. But over the summer, as Marjorie said, it's not inexpensive to do this well. So over the summer, many of us joke about the summer that never was, because we had workshop after workshop after workshop on technology, on pedagogy, on strategies to redesign your course. We had a new learning management system we had to learn so that we could take advantage of some new features. And so all of that has been about quality, and can we have a quality distributed educational product? And I think the answer is yes. And I think the flexibility that comes from that is extremely exciting.
I mean, from my observation, everything Derrick has said is consistent with the things that I see intermittently. I think the situation may be a little bit different for undergraduates. And at least in this country, there has been an experience where coming together on a campus for those who are able to do it is part of the transition from adolescence to adulthood. They learn to live together, learn to experience diversity, which they might not have had wherever they came from. I mean, there's so many complex things that are not part of the curriculum, but are part of that experience. But I think once you're talking about graduate education and more mature students, I'm 100% with Derrick that the new technology, by putting a spotlight on pedagogy and forcing people to pay attention to it who could evade it before, we will end up in a higher quality place.
Mm-hmm. Martin, you're nodding your head. You agree?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think a lot of it is what you put into it. I mean, I agree with Derrick that, this was the summer that wasn't, because we spent an awful lot of time on things that, we never had to deal with before. I can remember reading a piece in the New York Times where some students were complaining that this was, glorified Skype, what they were getting. And it's like, that, and I felt actually personally offended by that, just because, it sort of disregards all of the work that all of us has been putting into trying to make this great. I mean, and it's not just, it's not just starting, but it's also listening and adapting as you go. I mean, I talk to my students all the time about how it's going for them and how, what we can change, what works better for them. And I've actually had to completely adapt my lesson plans, my teaching plans because of it. So for example, I started out with a flipped classroom model. And after the first few weeks, I asked my students how they liked it, and they said they hated it. They wanted to go back to a more, normal classroom, synchronous classroom model. And so I just switched on the spot, This is the kind of thing that we all have had to do, I think, because every topic is different, every group of students is different. And so there isn't a single solution, and the discovery of it is what's important, I think. It goes back to what Marjorie said about,
needs to be interpreted differently depending on who it's being applied to. So your kind of flexibility, Martin, I think is fantastic. When you go to a university and say the students have said they want X and the university says no, it will be Y, I think that probably is what lies behind the question, that some administrations get very locked into, I don't know, particular platforms, particular learning tools, and people say, well, we would rather have this and that. And the technology can be a facilitator, but it can also be a tremendous irritant at times. And I think coping with that in this COVID age is particularly challenging. And I hate to say it, but we're actually at the end. I would really like to thank all the participants. I hope you found this helpful. There will be more webinars in the series of TPRC, which will be on substantive issues. I believe the next one will be on digital divide type issues, which are very important these days. And I would very much like to thank my fellow panelists. You've been wonderful.
We want to thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And goodbye to all of you who are out there. This webinar is ending now.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Great to serve with you guys.
Likewise.